Hello and welcome. I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you very much, LogPoint, for having me kick off this absolutely fantastic lineup of presentations today. We're going to be talking about how to drive value from security data. I'm going to take you in a little bit of a journey of where log management and SIEM has been, where we have arrived today, what some of the challenges are that we're facing, and we're going to look a little bit into the future of where this whole space is moving. My name is Rafael Marti. I've spent the last 2 decades in security and data analytics. In 2002, I joined a company called ArcSight, which very quickly became the de facto standard in the SIEM space. After ArcSight, I joined a small startup of 50 people, which is today one of the largest data analytics plays. That company was Splunk. I was the chief security strategist, helping Splunk expand their use cases into the security market. Right after Splunk, I tried myself as a founder of a company called Loggly, where we built the first log management solution in the cloud. After that, it was a time when big data really started entering the map and people started getting frustrated with the existing SIEM products. At the time, I started diving much more into big data, looked very deeply into artificial intelligence, data science, and visualization for security. But enough about myself. We're at a very interesting point in time in the log management and SIEM space. It's really time where we have the tools to drive much more value from our security data. And that is exactly what LogPoint is about as well. Let's have a look at a little bit of a history lesson of the security data or the log management and SIEM space. I'm going to start in the 1980s. This is really when we started seeing the first sort of logging approach with syslog on the Unix systems. We then entered a phase of log management that lasted a little longer than the 1999s. It started overlapping with the next phase, but it really started early on there. And it was really about collecting data, searching through the data, and having some very simple reporting use cases on top of that data. We then entered the SIEM, and back in the day, it was actually called without an E, just SIEM space, the security information management space, which really added a couple of components on top of the log management part. It added the correlation piece. Specifically, back in the day, it was about correlating IDS data with vulnerability data to understand which systems are actually vulnerable to some of these attacks. We added incident management, and what really saved the SIEM products is the compliance use cases, specifically PCI. Without that, I don't think we would have a SIEM market today, because people did not really see the value in collecting all this data back then, and compliance really added that very valuable use cases on top. Then we had a little bit of an intermediate phase where a few things happened. We started having a common event format that helped standardizing some of the data communication. Big data started entering the map with Hadoop and Spark, and people trying to move to that world. And we had the first log management as a service player with Loggly, moving this use case into the cloud for a cloud product. Then we had a little bit of an open source phase where we got some really good open source tool, the Elk Stack, Elasticsearch. We had an open source project, which initially was called OpenSOC, which then was named Apache Metron, that tried to define a framework on top of the big data components to deal with security use cases. And then we entered this world that I call here the logging Wild West, where suddenly there's all these tools branching off from the SIEM world, UEBA, right? The user and entity behavior analytics space. We had metrics being added to the log management component, not just logs, but also metrics can be analyzed now. We had the source space with automation. We have suddenly entering the DevSecOps use cases, and then this new movement of XDR, which if you actually start digging in and try to understand what's the difference to SIEM, you will realize it's really just a little bit more of, you have more focused use cases, a little more focus on the data you're bringing in to drive much more value, instead of having just a sort of large data platform that can do anything, but you still have to sort of customize a lot of things. What is interesting is that the UEBA and the source space, you will not find many standalone UEBA or SOAR tools out there anymore. They were either acquired by larger vendor platforms, or they added SIEM use cases up top. So they did not survive as their own use case or platforms, but they started to be bolted on to existing platforms. Going forward, is a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but there is a big data framework called the security data lakehouse, and I wonder whether we're starting to move towards that soon as well. But let's see what happens there in the future. Here's another layer to this whole thing where I'm showing some of the analytics components. I'm not going to talk through all of them, but what I want to highlight here is that anomaly detection is something that we've been doing for over 20 years. We have been doing this for quite a long time, and there has been a little bit of memory loss in the industry. And I would urge some people actually go back, look at some of the things that have been done before the turn of the century. There's some really good approach that we should probably dig back up and maybe expand it with the new technologies we have today and see what we can do there to improve on these things. The other thing I want to highlight here is a couple, which is in sort of 2006, that's a movement that I was very involved with, which was the data visualization for cybersecurity. And unfortunately, we're still nowhere in that space. We don't really have very elaborate visualization systems to help us explore the data and understand it much easier. We have some simple things with dashboards and some visualizations, but I think there's still lots of room to grow into that. And then the last point I'm mentioning here is so the risk centricity, which is something that I'll talk much more in the next slides. That is really something I believe is probably one of the core movements that we need to pay attention to. And then finally, yet another swim lane here, a little more data. What I want to show you here is that initially SIEMs were really focused on sort of network data, firewalls, IDS, flow logs like network flows. And then only in 2009, we started adding endpoint data. Today, I really urge you, if you have a SIEM, make sure you're getting some endpoint data, at least from your critical systems, that can give you much more insights on what's actually happening on these systems. And then the last piece here is that data activity. And we're going to talk about that a little more in the next slide as well, which is really, we need to start focusing more on what is our data doing. And I'll show you in a second why that is very critical. So with that, let's jump into the present. And let's see what are some of the challenges out there. And I made sort of 4 buckets that I see. The first is around use cases. I think my belief is that often we're focusing on the wrong use cases. I got a lot of calls from companies that are asking me, what are the use cases we should implement? And right away, they're like, oh, and by the way, we have network data and this and this and this. What should we do with all that? And I'm like, okay, hold your horses. What are the use cases you want to implement? What are the things you need to protect your company from? What poses the highest risk? Keep in mind that, what is the statistic? It's only about less than 60% of attacks, or more than 60% of attacks are not happening through vulnerabilities being exploited, but happening through some other means. Mostly, email is a huge threat vector. Now, let's take that example further. Do you have visibility into your email communications, understand when there's something potentially bad going on? Do you have visibility in your Office 365, which is very likely the email provider that you're using? Do you hook into those APIs to understand what's happening in your email? That is a focus on use cases, understanding that. Make sure that when you're building these use cases, also go and ask your peers, what are the use cases you have implemented? Start sharing your detection use cases. Scalability, another challenge. And the scalability starts technically in terms of how many rules can you actually run in your SIEM before the SIEM starts slowing down a lot. And there's still a limit to that. So it's not just infinitely scalable. Even if you have a cloud-based SIEM, there's still limitations on how much you can actually process, and you have to write rules that are easy to process for these systems. But it's also a scalability around use cases, building the right processes to take care of the events that these things actually generate, and then remediate around those use cases and those alerts that you're seeing. So scalability in many ways is definitely still challenging today. Then on the data side, we have a number of gaps in visibility. As I just mentioned, email. Are you monitoring the email communication? Do you understand what normal email patterns are? Which ones are risky email communications? And then around applications. Do you see into the critical applications? Do you see into your SaaS applications, your Salesforce, your Workday, your SAP, your ERP, whatever you have that's running in the cloud? And do you understand the inventory of your systems? Do you know what's there? Do you know that you're actually monitoring everything in your environment? And finally, the fourth challenge here, I put on the false positives. We're in this world where we're very threat and exploit and vulnerability centric, and all of these different systems are generating alerts, and we're trying to prioritize them to figure out which ones are actually important. Well, we're in this such an event-driven world rather than moving to an entity-driven world where we start looking at users and devices and understand their risks. Now, I'll talk about that a little more in my next slide here. Now, what are some trends in these different areas of challenges? Well, on the use cases side, I'm seeing much more of a move to data centricity. So understanding what your data is doing, which in the end is really what you want to understand. Where's your critical data? Who has access? And where is it going? Because a lot of the attacks will focus on getting to your critical data, your IP, your financial data, your customer list, and so on. So you want to protect your data. You want to understand how that's moving around. Shared frameworks in use cases. Everybody's talking about the MITRE ATT&CK framework to understand sort of inventory, all the different types of attacks and the components of these attacks. I actually think in the SIEM realm, this is a little dangerous because it is not the attack TTPs or the entries in there are not necessarily covering all of the different things that you should be monitoring. There's more that you should be looking at, and they don't map directly to use cases. And even worse, if you start looking at one of these TTPs, if you look at how to detect or remediate these problems, they're often very, very vague. They're like, watch the behavior of your processes and make sure they're not opening strange network connections. That is super vague. What does that mean? Which processes to look at? What's the critical network connections? What's normal? So we need still a detection framework or a set of rules that we can share that is sort of standardized. There's a project called Sigma, which has started doing that. It's a good starting point, but we need much more effort behind that. Scalability. I'm seeing a trend where we're not just doing central analytics anymore, but we're also pushing things down onto the endpoints and start doing more analytics and even remediations at the place of the data generation, endpoints, right? Endpoint protection products. They're starting, they're all remediating or stopping attacks rather than sending all the data centrally, and then the system has to make a decision and tell the endpoint to block something. And we need to see more of that, where the decisions are already made, if possible, on these data collection points, and only otherwise sends the data centrally, and then you can make further decisions there. We're moving to the cloud. Make no mistake, all of your systems will run in the cloud at some point, including your SIEM. Matter of time if you're not already there. We have to deal with that, which brings its own challenges of data governance, data sovereignty, privacy, and so on. On the data input side, we need to have visibility across our clouds, across our SaaS platforms, right? We want to move beyond alerts and events. And on the false positive side, and then again, I will talk about this in the next slide, is we really need to move to an entity-centric, risk-centric model, which is going to be absolutely crucial for going into the future. So how do we do this? And how do we drive more value from our security data? Well, we need to become risk-centric. Imagine this service that collects data and computes a risk for your different entities. So for your users, for your devices, for your applications, and also for your data, understanding what is the risk that this thing exposes right now. We want to get to this risk world because we want to escape this cat and mouse game, right? In the security industry, the bad guys are coming up with find a new vulnerability, build new exploits. The security community catches up, tries to build a remediation for that, a new signature, a new update for your firewall, a new detection, a new piece of threat intelligence that's put out there. We're never going to get ahead of that game. We need to fundamentally start understanding our different entities, our users and data and so on. So how we do that is we're getting input around these different entities about the users. Who are my users? Hook into Active Directory, understand the roles of your users. Get from your HR system, get the managerial structures, get all kinds of additional information about your users. But then also understand what your users are doing. What systems are they logging in? Where are they logging in from? And you can go even further. You can try to understand what kinds of things are people looking at on the web and start derive certain human factors from that. Then the devices, the same thing. You want to understand the posture, the vulnerabilities, the configurations. You want to know what devices you have. What are they doing? Same for applications, including your SaaS applications, right? You want to hook into maybe using a CASB to hook into these APIs to understand what your Salesforce is doing. What records are people accessing? And then a real shift into understanding your data. What is the data doing? Like your data, what is your critical data? Getting an inventory, doing a classification on that, understanding how the data moves around, getting all that into this risk system. And then you can use the risk when you have resource access decisions to make. Guess what this is? Zero trust network access, right? So how is this risk thing working in here? Well, there's an anomaly detection engine in here, which by the way is not easy to be built, right? But we need to understand what's normal for all these different entities. What's normal behavior? You want to understand what these entities are and how do you, like, what's the risk of this thing? If it has a certain posture and configuration, what is the risk it exposes? And then you have a layer of security knowledge. And you see there's these expert on the bottom. These are people that can help teach the system what is normal and what is not outside of anomaly detection and these other more complex engines. The nice thing of all of that is you throw that into something we call in artificial intelligence, we call it a belief network, which basically learns what is normal and what's the risk of these different things given certain inputs. The great thing about that is, contrary to some other approaches in artificial intelligence and machine learning, you can actually look at what the system learned and the experts can go and make tweaks in there. And it's actually something we see more and more products out there in the security space doing. Now, with that, what are some of the future aspects? What are the themes in the security data analytics space that are going to be of importance, and it's probably something you want to compare your solutions against as well? With AI and ML, it has been talked about so much, and a lot of people think this is the solution to everything. Let's be clear, it is not. It will help solve certain problems. It's been really good already in certain things, finding patterns in large amounts of data. It's been really good in malware classification. And it's been good because we have large amounts of data we can train these systems on. But for a lot of the things that we're doing, especially in your SIEM with these expert rules, there's not much training data that you could use. So a lot of these things are not going to be AI and ML driven. In fact, there is a movement that I think we should get behind a little more as well, which is pushing some of our detections rather than into this black box, crazy AI ML system. We want to push some of these problems to the user. What do I mean by that? Think about, there's an anomalous login from a user onto a system. We have never seen that. It's strange, and all kinds of signs, all kinds of warning signs go off. Well, you can send an alert to the SOC. Guess what the SOC's going to do? The Security Operations Center, the analysts, they're going to go and ask the owner of the system and the owner of the user account, did you intend for this to happen? They both can say yes. Well, but we already had a round trip. Why don't we send that information to these owners right away and tell them, hey, your user just logged into this system, and tell the system owner, hey, this user just logged in. Was that okay? They can say, yes, fine. We know it looks weird, but we actually granted that. If they say, no, we have no idea what this is, then you can involve the SOC. But they already have this first question out of the way. So we need to start thinking about these processes and get the SOC and the analysts out of the loop. Cloud. I said it before, your SIEM is going to be in the cloud. Get used to it. Figure out how to deal with privacy and governance, and figure out how to monitor your on-prem premises, your on-prem systems and devices. Visibility. We need to get visibility across everything. And just to tell you, or to show you a little bit of how hard this can be, I wrote a blog post recently about that there's one very foundational question of how many assets do you have in your environment right now? How many of you can answer that question right now? And if you can, which I actually doubt that anyone can really get to 100%, like, yes, this is exactly how many we have. If you can, do you know who owns the system? What patch level they have? Whether they're a problem, like they have exposed vulnerabilities, and so on. So it's so fundamental to understand what you have. If you do incident response, you want to know what your inventory is. What you don't know about, you can't protect. Automation. We need to get not just to SOAR, but we need to get to automation and remediation for any alert we see. Ideally, there's a system already taking care of it. There's an opportunity here to move to zero trust network access as well, to do some of this whole automation. And then finally, privacy, especially if we start monitoring our entities a little closer. We need to make sure this happens in a privacy first way. Make sure you anonymize your data. You only collect what you have to collect. You only keep it as long as you really have to keep it. And make sure that all the different data sovereignty and data privacy guidelines are adhered to. And make sure that you're ethically doing the right thing as well here. With that, let's summarize what I just talked about. We want to gain complete visibility across devices, users, data, applications, and the cloud. Start with inventory, and then we want to know what these things are doing. On the analytics side, make sure it's use case driven, not data driven. Figure out how to get left of boom, detect these things before they happen. Share your detection logic, whatever you come up with to detect these things, and move to a world of risk/zero trust. Ideally, with open standards, you don't want to be locked into just one vendor and have to buy all of their different tools, from the firewall, the DLP, to encryption, to the web proxy. Open standards, and we want to move towards automation. Ideally, we want to get a unified platform across all these different sort of shoot-offs from the SIEM, right? UEBA, SOAR, XDR, threat intelligence platforms, continuous compliance monitoring. I would like to see all this in one platform. And then finally, can you outsource all of this? Why would you spend time teaching people, finding the talent, building the systems, maintaining the data of these very complex environments if you could outsource it and give the money to experts that manage this across multiple customers that can scale their knowledge that way? So I really urge you to think about that. With that, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. I hope you have time to listen to some of the other presentations. The agenda definitely looks super interesting. And with that, I want to hand it back to LogPoint. Have a fabulous conference.